Hi everyone, this is Ricky Spencer and welcome to another of our Sociology of Media Voices series. And today we're going to talk about what is an advisory committee, what sort of roles do they do? And in specifically, we're going to really talk about the importance of LGBTIQA SB plus involvement and participating in government. And we have a wonderful opportunity to hear from somebody who has been in a position where they are co-chair of an advisory group in Victoria, and we're going to learn about it. And they are also currently looking for new members. So I thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to chat with to Jayde Bondt and hear about their incredible role in this space, what got them motivated to be involved, what do they feel that they've achieved, and then we're going to unpack a little bit with Jayde what's involved and perhaps really inspire those who are listening, or those who have friends who are listening, to really consider taking up this important opportunity that will really build your networks and really give you a sense of doing something for the community. Welcome, Jayde.
Thanks, Ricky. Thank you for having me.
So let's start at the beginning, Jayde. Um, what is, before we get to a bit, what is an advisory committee and what is the importance of somebody being a member of an advisory committee?
Yeah, no worries, Ricky. I mean, in terms of more generally, an advisory committee or a steering group or working group or working party is really a voice of individuals from a broad section of the cohort that the advisory committee is advising on. But in essence, it really is a group of people who are providing advice to the people who are making decisions or leading or building or informing a project, program, or a broad suite of initiatives. Strategies generally have advisory committees, policies, governance, anything related to compliance. So advisory committees are pretty much just that. It's a group of people who are providing advice, and hopefully, through providing that advice, the people making the decisions have a really well rounded and more holistic perspective of how their decisions can really inform and shape the communities in which they're trying to serve. So, it's a really important role. And a really influential role, and one that I think anyone who's advising is should take incredibly seriously and humbly. Thanks.
And tell us, how did you get involved in the advisory group and what's the name of the advisory group?
Yeah. So the advisory group that I'm a part of is the Victorian Government's LGBTIQ plus task force. So we advise government really around LGBTIQ plus related issues, strengths, empowerment, really around how we can enable LGBTIQ plus um, SB folk to really be involved in community life, to have a thriving, holistic, and well way of moving through their various life stages. And very much the way in which I got involved is I was part of the inaugural government's LGBTIQ plus leadership program. And through that program, I started to connect with various different rainbow cohorts. And when the opportunity came to apply for this role several years ago, 4 years ago now, while nervous and I guess a little bit apprehensive as to whether I was the right fit or not, I decided to give it a go, given that I felt that my area of expertise in diversity, inclusion, intersectionality, and strategy development could really enhance the government's commitment at the time to an LGBTIQ plus strategy. Which now is Pride in Our Future, which is a 10-year whole of government LGBTIQ plus strategy. So yeah, that's how I got involved, and very much the group that I'm a part of.
And for people who are listening, and they're probably feeling, oh my gosh, I don't know if I have the
Mm,
qualification. Do, do you need to have any specific
mm,
qualifications or particular type of experience to be considered eligible to be a part of this particular group?
mm. So the LGBTIQ plus task force and the various working groups. So there's a health and wellbeing working group and a justice working group, and very much the work that is done is really to shape policy reform, strategy, program design, anything related to, as I said, empowering rainbow people to live thriving lives within Victoria and beyond. And so I think it is in some context, so the Justice Working Group and the Health and Wellbeing Working Group, it is handy and useful to have expertise, professional expertise in those areas or fields, as well as lived experience. With the LGBTIQ plus task force, it's definitely handy to have professional experience in things like understanding strategy or understanding community development. But at the same point in time, we're very mindful, as government is, as all of their various current members are mindful of the fact that our communities are incredibly diverse. And actually, what we need in order to progress the equality commitment in this state is a diversity of thought and a diversity of voices, because um, our communities are incredibly diverse. And so we want our working groups and task force to be reflective of that, to ensure we serve as many people, hopefully all of the people within our communities as possible. So to get back to your point around whether or not you have to have a certain level of experience, it's very much around understanding who you are and what you can bring. So it's understanding your lived experience, as well as, yes, it's wonderful if you have some professional experience, but that could be in volunteering, that could be in community development, that could be in kind of a legal professional setting, that could be as a nurse or a doctor or a midwife. It could be navigating some various different systems in your own lived experience, and them and those systems not working for you, and you having that unique skill set to understand and possibly provide suggestions around what could work. So I think, again, I would say the task force and the working groups are there to have a diversity of voices, a diversity of experience, but also I think a diversity as well of um, ages and life stages and geographic locations. You know, there is so much we can do in order to continue to shift the dial for rainbow folk in this state. And we can't do it unless we hear from different people and different voices, as well as those who hold positions of leadership already within our communities. So it's bringing those groups and people together in order to shift the dial.
And how often do the advisory group that you're involved in, or those two specifically, meet? And what is the typical duration of the people who are part of that involvement?
Of course. So for the Health, Justice and Task Force, the terms of reference state that each term is for 2 years. So if you were to apply for this round, your term would be for a 2-year period. In terms of how often they meet, so Task Force meet 4 times a year, and Justice meet 6 times, as well as Health and Wellbeing 6 times a year. In terms of, so they're the formal meetings. Each meeting runs for 2 hours, but I would be underselling it if I didn't say that there are connections and meetings that sit around those sessional times. So often there is a lot of discussion around what are the issues, what are we doing well? Like, what is a strengths-based approach to looking at our communities? If kind of contemporary issues arise or things like COVID pop up, you do have to kind of be flexible and agile in the ways in which you meet and connect, because there's a lot that can happen in a 2 or 4 month period between sittings. So very much I don't want to undersell the commitment, but I also don't want to oversell. It's not, you know, unless you are in a chairing role, it is not a day-to-day kind of full-time job. It is very much something that is in essence a volunteer role with paid remuneration for those sessional times in which you're meeting.
Mm. And maybe you kind of sort of answered it with my next question. What specific roles and responsibilities do members of the advisory group have?
Yeah. Yeah, so there is a chair for or co-chairs for each of the groups. So myself as the co-chair for the task force, and then there's a co-chair for justice, as well as the health and wellbeing working group. So Janet Jukes is currently the co-chair for justice, and Adam Bourne's currently the co-chair for health and wellbeing. In essence, the roles outside of the co-chairing role, which I'll come back to, are very much around the sessional members reflecting and connecting and engaging with their rainbow networks and understanding kind of some of the challenges as well as some of the strengths. And some of the really good work that is happening out there, and bringing that information back into government. So when we are meeting and discussing the strategy, the outcomes framework, particular policy reform and things like that, that we're providing government with the relevant advice around where they should direct and support their resourcing in order to inform and help that progression of the equality agenda. In terms of outside of that, so the co-chairing role is very in addition to working with the stakeholder groups and kind of pulling that information back and feeding that into government. The co-chair's role is really around trying to be proactive in progressing some of the work that needs to be done. So whether that's in justice, health and wellbeing, or task force, it's around, okay, what is on the horizon? You know, what do we need to talk about with government now, possibly to prevent some of these things exploding or popping up and impacting communities very dramatically in the future. It's also around doing administration things, you know, making sure that agendas and minutes are on point, ensuring that conflicts of interest are noted and things like that. So there's an administrative role to being a co-chair, but also it's about that thinking ahead and working with government to be mindful of what's happening now, but also what could happen in the future. And then also reflecting on the past. I mean, sometimes we have a habit within our communities of going full steam ahead, that we forget that there's some really wonderful things that have occurred to get us to this point, and some really integral individuals who have driven that work. And actually we can lean on our history in order to inform and drive our future. So that is also the role of the co-chair.
How are the recommendations and advice provided by the advisory group considered and integrated into the decision-making processes?
Mm, mm. I think this comes back to the relationships that you have with the members of and representatives of government. in terms of the formal mechanisms, very much there are things like agenda, minutes taken. The agenda is really clear around what is going to be discussed in the meeting and what advice is being sought. So at the moment, we talk about Pride in Our Future strategy, and very much kind of one of the 4 main areas of the strategy and how the actions are going to be implemented. So the advice often tends in specific task force meetings tends to be in relation to the strategy, as well as some of the other areas or contemporary issues that are happening within communities right now. And so the minutes very much are taken there. I'm also very mindful, and it's something that we've learned across both my terms of task force, but that before is sometimes people don't always feel confident speaking in a large group setting, and actually their voices are really important and needed. And so we do have mechanisms by which the co-chair can talk, have phone calls, have Zoom, have Teams meetings with task force members outside of sessional times in order to gauge that feedback. But also things like email are really useful. So the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing and the branch we liaise with and connected to in task force is the Equality branch, and they're very proactive in terms of providing their email to us and being open and willing to have conversations. I think it is, though, really important for advisory members to understand, that we are providing advice, so we can't we can't force anyone's hand, but we can provide the best advice based on what we know from the communities we engage with, and through the conversations we have with government, hopefully shift that dial. Reform is a long game. There are a lot of moving parts within the machinations of government. So it is important for whoever chooses to be involved to really have that long game in mind and be, I guess, willing to ride the highs and lows of policy and reform work, because otherwise you will get burnt out. So it's just being really mindful of that, particularly in roles such as the working groups and task force.
And how does the advisory group stay informed and up to date on relevant industry trends, research, and best practices?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is so everyone has a different approach. From my approach as the co-chair of task force, I really believe in the people around me and their stakeholder connections and engagements. And that's the point of having a diverse and representative task force as well as working groups, is that each person is going to have their own connections and stakeholder groups that they can reach out to. For me, when I was joined task force, my connections are very much in sport and local government. And now actually I work in higher education, so now higher education, but and I'm from rural Victoria. My parents are dairy farmers, and so I have a lot of connections who haven't necessarily lived an out life. They have felt quite closeted and have their own unique experiences living through that. Growing up in rural and regional Victoria, I was connected to a lot of faith-based settings. So I have that lens, and I'm a a bi plus individual. I fall under that broad bi pan part of our communities. So I think for me, I know that's where my stakeholder groups are. And so I would engage with my stakeholder groups, and then we would have say Margarita Coppolino, who has a really diverse network, who's been incredibly involved in the establishment of Inclusive Rainbow Voices, who sits on the ILGA board internationally, who has a different, stakeholder lens, is highly involved in AGMC. And so everyone brings all these different groups, and together we can come into the room and hopefully have a really reflective discussion. Now, that's not to say we'll always get it right, but the ways in which I have looked at this as a co-chair are sometimes having a really almost not a decentralized approach, but a localized approach to the ways in which task force members can engage with their communities. Because if I tried to do it all, firstly, I wouldn't be the right person to get in all the various rooms and spaces. But also too, I just physically wouldn't be able to do it. I work a full-time job. I'm a parent. I do this as well. So it's, I think having those relationships and really deep networks and being able to lean and engage with those networks is really important. Also too, like kind of the commissioner's office send out often kind of a meltwater on a week-to-week basis for us around all the articles that are happening, all the research that is happening. Many of us kind of are subscribed to a whole number of newsletters across our sector. So, Thorn Harbour Health, Queerspace, Drummond Street, Rainbow, gosh, for the life of me, there's so many of them. But it's just everywhere. There's so many. And so we all sign up to all of them. And by doing so, we're able to pull in some really wonderful information that informs our work. So it's multimodal. I definitely would say, though, we are deeply involved and engaged within our stakeholder networks. But as well as that, we are signed up to newsletters. We do kind of a bit of a desktop audit. Often we attend events. It's a multi-pronged approach. I hope that answers your question. I've gone on a bit of a tangent, haven't I?
No, I think it's wonderful that you've explained to people listening what actually is involved, and it's that self awareness that you take ownership of that journey, and that knowledge you acquire through being connected to, grassroots community
Mm,
and established community spaces really gives you that
mm,
rich fullness of a snapshot of what's happening.
mm.
And going on with that, can you provide an example of a specific recommendation or piece of advice that the advisory group has provided and how it was implemented?
Mm, mm. And I think this is where I'll say reform is a long game, right? So for us, I think the LGBTIQ plus whole of government 10-year strategy is an incredible example of advice that the task force has provided that has been implemented. However, that didn't start on my task force term. That started 4 years prior when the inaugural task force was established, and Brenda Appleton was co-chair. And that task force did an incredible amount of work in establishing a lot of the groundwork and advice that then led into our task force and the 2 terms that I've been involved in making sure that that happened. So in terms of kind of where I entered the picture and my task force term started was really when the consultation period had happened, was about to kick off. And so our role at that point in time was to provide government with kind of really full picture of who should be consulted, how should they be consulted, are there people we've missed, Having drawing on the research that was out at the time of um, a really equitable approach to consultation as well. What does consultation look like for different stakeholder groups? How do we ensure that those groups, when the consultation is occurring, feel safe and valued? How do we communicate back to those stakeholder groups that what they have said is being considered and implemented? What's the timeline? So how do we be really accountable and transparent as a government to ensure that the people who are meaningfully giving up their time and often at sharing very vulnerable parts of themselves, how do we make sure that that's not a waste, and also too that once they do that, that that's not going to have individual repercussions or actually larger repercussions on them later down the track. So we provided, a lot of advice around how that could be rolled out. And look, I'll always say that some things aren't always perfect, progress over perfection at times. We know that that was the most in-depth consultation that government has ever run on a community group with a community cohort such as ours. And they had an incredibly large consultation process. They went far and wide. There was like road shows that occurred throughout the state. There was, I think, over 45, probably a lot more kind of Zoom and Teams meetings that went for several hours for many groups. There was a lot of engagement with sector leaders and organisations. There was broad consultations with general bodies who work with LGBTIQ plus folk. I mean, the scope and breadth of this consultation, I don't think had been seen to date, and still has not been seen since. And so it's something that you have to kind of be proud of, even if it's not perfect, or even if it's not necessarily the way you would do it in some parts. The advice really lent to then being able to build the whole of government LGBTIQ plus strategy that's 10 years, never been done before, hopefully will be done again since. But for that to occur is you cannot undersell it. And since then, we've been working with government to establish an outcomes framework that actually maps and tracks year on year the success of the strategy. Is it working? What needs to be changed? How can it be informed by contemporary issues? What's the research telling us? How do we evaluate things? And so that advice is currently playing out. And you know what? We'll continue into the next task force term. That's something that the incoming task force and broader working groups are going to have to take up the mantle. So that's why I say reform is a long game, because and why it's so important for co-chairs as well to kind of look back on the history is because actually once you understand the history and you understand why decisions were made at a certain time, you can continue to advocate for the road and the journey ahead without losing those really integral insights that were made at that specific time in the context that they were made. So there's plenty of others. I mean, in my term, kind of the reform around change and suppression practices occurred. The Pride Centre opened. Gosh, the Vahi report was released. I just keep trying to sit back and go, oh gosh, what have we achieved? But there's been so much. But that isn't just the work of this task force or these working groups. It actually is built on, 30 years of advocacy that people have done to get to this point.
And going on the framing of advocacy for the last 20 years, we've
Yeah.
seen a real shift in terms of access and inclusion,
Mhm.
also, within people living with disabilities.
Yeah.
What supports are there for somebody who has a disability,
Mm,
wants to be a part of the advisory group?
yeah. I think COVID COVID has done some terrible things to our communities, and we can't undersell the impact that that has had disproportionately as well on um, disabled folk or folk with disabilities within our communities. But if there is a silver lining, I'm not sure there is, but if there is, I think hybrid work and hybrid meetings is one of those. And so, and this is where I come from a perspective of inclusive design, is actually um, if you are now a person with a chronic illness, a disability, you have caring arrangements, you live in rural or regional Victoria, there are so many layers to this. You now can attend task force meetings in a hybrid way. And I think that's really, really important. The other part is there is closed captioning that occurs through the Teams meeting. So if you are deaf or hard of hearing, there is opportunities there. I'm also mindful that kind of if you are blind or you have vision impairments, there is some resourcing, and I don't want to speak out of school, but I'm mindful that I'm pretty confident there is resourcing there that if you needed particular software or support around kind of accessing those types of resources in order to contribute meaningfully, then I have no doubt that would be supported. I'm also aware that some of our kind of deaf and hard of hearing folk within our communities may, their first language is Auslan. So I'm also mindful that kind of there can be Auslan interpreters uh, that are supported as part of people's kind of part of the commitment to support a diverse group of task force and working group members engage in task force meaningfully. So I'm sure there are plenty of others in terms of bathrooms that, often our meetings are held at the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing, and there are all gender bathrooms as well as accessible bathrooms. And I also love that they're separate because I know that many people with a disability or chronic illness, it's very frustrating if they need to use the bathroom for someone else to be in the bathroom as well. So love that they're separate. Um, so yeah, there's a lot of means and mechanisms, I think, that support accessibility and people to meaningfully contribute, whether that's in person or online. I won't pretend that there haven't been some ups and downs with this. I mean, sometimes the room that we're in, for whatever reason, isn't always the best for listening. We think we've found the perfect room now for hybrid ways of working, but um, it's also being mindful as a co-chair as well that if you have people online, that kind of there's not this side chatter occurring, that the conversations are actually built in a way that can support hybrid environments. So I'd like to believe we've come a long way on task force and the working groups to support a diverse group of people, including those who are disabled and or have a disability or chronic illness. Um, I'm sure there is more that can be done, but I think there's a starting point that um, I would be confident in saying to people uh, who have accessibility requirements apply. You will have support, but you may just need to if there isn't the support at the time, you may need to say, actually I need X, Y, and Z. I know that will be welcomed. You probably shouldn't have to say that. It should be designed for you from the get-go. but at the same time, I'm confident that you'll be heard in terms of your requirements.
Wonderful. You really captured a lot of the threading of this very important space. Now, for the question, if I know at the moment there are vacancies, what is the process? So how do people, if they're listening, how do they go about applying for a position on the advisory committee?
Yeah, no worries. So, yeah, there'll be quite a lot of vacancies. The terms of reference really ensures that there is a diversity of voices over the years as well. So that you don't have someone on a working group or task force who's there for 30 years and actually we're not developing a new set of voices coming through. So there is vacancies. I encourage you to apply. There is the application is reasonably, you can Google Victorian LGBTIQ plus task force and a link will pop up and you just have to click on that and then there'll be an apply now. You can also go through, I think, the Careers Vic or the Board Vacancies Vic website that's connected to the Victorian government and you'll be able to see kind of LGBTIQ plus sessional members applications and you can click on that link. It all takes you to the same place. You can Google my name or on LinkedIn and I've just done a post which has the link. I know there's a lot of task force members who are sharing the links at the moment as well. So hopefully that can get you there. In terms of once you apply, if you do need an accessible link to apply, you can download that. There's a Word document there from my understanding. And also there is an email there if for whatever reason you're struggling to use the online form, you can connect with DIFA, Department of Families, Fairness and Housing, and they'll be able to direct you as to what best suits. I have heard of historically maybe people having phone conversations to support applications as well. In terms of the application itself, so there's several questions around who you are, so kind of those multi-choice questions of and you know your name, your address, your preferred pronouns, your preferred name, all of those things. And then there's a few questions around who are you, what's your experience, how do you believe you can contribute in a meaningful way. So just a few questions that you can answer as part of your application that really talk to why you want to be involved in this role and what's your experience. And then you upload, if you've got one, a CV as well. Again, I would just say that it's okay to talk about who you are and your lived experience as well as your professional experience. I think the role of task force provides you a really great opportunity to entwine these two parts of your identity to really make an impact. And then once the applications are in, there's a short list of which task force and working group members are not involved. That's all through government. And then there's an interview with the shortlisted parties, and then a decision is made. And from that, the minister has to sign off on the commissioner's office, the minister's office, and then for the co-chair roles, that goes up to cabinet for support and endorsement. So it is a bit of a process, and from my understanding as well, given that there's not much time left in this year, that's why the department are working really hard now to try and get this through. So there is a task force announced and working groups announced by the end of year.
Well, thank you so much for really enlightening us and deep diving into the importance of how people from community can have a voice and be part of a decision-making team that can really kind of help shape the future of the LGBTIQ ASB plus communities into the future in Victoria. It's been wonderful speaking with you, Jayde Bondt.
No worries. Thanks so much, Ricky.